Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. And as always, I'm joined by my two delectable co-hosts, Dave Johnson and Kate Bakos. Good morning.
Delectable indeed.
Hey, Mike.
Well, I thought I'd show you a bit of love.
Yeah. Share the love, mix it up. I love it.
I love how uncomfortable it's made you both feel, so we'll just move on from that.
Delectable.
I'm thinking about that for our listeners.
I know. Well, we've got to give them a taste of the dynamic that maybe they will see off the camera if they come to our live event next year.
Oh,
so,
yes.
subtle little plug there.
Yep,
we've got
I got the link.
Of interest thing ready.
Yep. No, we've already got two, which is a bit exciting. Excellent. So, considering it just literally went out last night, we done
great.
Gee,
I think we can fit 40 to 50 in the auditorium as well.
Great.
So, Kate, how do people register their interest? Just while we're on the topic.
Yes, on our show notes on the website, I'll be embedding that at the bottom of every week's show notes. So all you need to do is click on there. I'll also put registrations up on our Facebook page, and if you want to contact us on our Instagram page as well, the Property Trio. So you can find us either on the website, on LinkedIn, on the website, on Facebook, or on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. We will be capping it. We can only take so many people in the auditorium, but all of the details will be there.
If it goes that well, we might book Madison Square Garden for the following year, but we want to set a little bit of a modest expectation and have an intimate affair with our delectable hosts. Let's get down to business. We've got a listener question from Alex. So a little bit of background to Alex we'll share in a second, but his wonderful comments were, thank you so much for your podcast. You guys are amazing, so informative, knowledgeable, helpful. Gosh, it sounds like we've written this ourselves. The good news is he said that he's learned so much from the podcast and helped in the last few years in their own journey and building their knowledge base around property and investing, and that's why we're here. So wonderful to hear that feedback. We really appreciate it. So with Alex, as by way of background, his partner and himself, they're both 28 years old, combined base salary of $171K a year, combined living expenses of $50K a year, and for anyone playing at home, they're both living at home, so that's the way they're getting it done so cheaply. They have two investment properties, a two-bed townhouse in Reservoir in Melbourne, approximately $700K value with a $500K loan, purchased 2 years ago for $700, approximately 3 years old. Then we got a two-bedder in Pascoe Vale in Melbourne as well, approximate value of $600K with a $500K loan, purchased 3 years ago for $550, approximately 10 years old. So then we get down to what they're trying to achieve and their life circumstances. So in the next 2 years, they're looking to get engaged, get married, and hopefully start a family around age 31, aiming to have 2 kids. We'd also like to purchase and move into a PPOR together within the next 2 years. Dave, this has got to be music to your ears, the level of planning that they've put into this already.
Well, look, it's always great when people know what they want and are pretty clear on what they'd like to do. It certainly makes the planning process simpler, not necessarily easy, but at least, some parts of it are in terms of what they personally want out of their lives, and family planning, and, when they want to buy a home, that certainly helps.
Excellent. Well, a little bit more meat on the bones here. Alex says, I'm sure you can probably figure out we don't have enough money coming in to cover 2 investment properties and a principal place of residence, especially considering they'd like a 3 or 4 bedroom house in Melbourne where they can raise a family and maybe live in for the next 10 years. They're not too fussed about a living location too close to the city. They currently both live at home about 20 Ks from Melbourne CBD. So they'd like to buy something in a similar vicinity to the city, so within 20 Ks. So the question is, what do you think would be the best approach for someone similar to our position and similar goals? The way they see it, the options that we have are, we've gone into 1, 2, 3, and 4. So do you guys want to run with those options, maybe starting with you, Dave, on what they've sort of laid out, and that'll give you an opportunity to maybe critique the insights that they've got there?
Yeah, so look, they've just touched on a few options, and we'll get to those. So keep both investment properties and stay at home, and wait until they go up and equity increases, and then they can borrow enough from the bank to provide enough deposit. You've got to be mindful that they're going to have kids. They're hoping Melbourne prices will increase in the next few years. But they're worried the townhouses may not increase at a great enough rate. So there's always complexity, even though they know when they want to, when they're getting married and how many kids they plan to have, and that they want to move out and buy a home. So do they sell one of the investment properties and incur all the costs with that, and then buy a principal place of residence? Do they move into one of their investments, which they're open to do, and wait until their incomes get high enough to then buy a principal place of residence? They've also considered a fourth option, and I think this is just a great example again for our listeners. I mean, how things can get quite complex, particularly as you get towards planning for that principal place of residence. If you haven't planned for it from the start of your property purchasing journey, which isn't always possible, but that's what's happened with these guys. There's all this complexity here because all of a sudden the principal place of residence and the family is now on the horizon, and they can't afford that principal place of residence. So a fourth option they've considered is to keep both properties and see if they can buy another investment property and potentially move into it. So look, they've touched on a bunch of options there, and we'll work through each of those. But yeah, look, I've got a few thoughts on some of what they should do to put them in the best possible position. So just like to begin with, they have said they are willing to keep staying at home. So I would actually encourage them to stay at home, living at home for as long as they are happy to, and it suits their lifestyle, because obviously this is going to allow them to save more money and keep the investment properties for longer. What they should be doing also is, in the meantime, speak with their strategic mortgage broker and determine what their actual borrowing capacity is. What would it be if they sold one investment property? What would it be if they sold the other? What would it be if they sold both? What would their max purchase price be for a new home? They should also be reviewing the market and finding out what the price point for a new home would be. And we've actually followed them up, and they've told us that answer would be about $850,000 at this point. Mindful one townhouse is worth $700,000, the other's worth $600,000. Look, another option for them is stay at home for as long as you can, do those numbers, understand where your potential position sits, but then also look at renting initially, which they haven't touched on. This allows them to try before they buy, trial a location, the type of property, where they may want to raise their kids. They can start a family whilst they're renting. It allows them to keep both investment properties for longer to get more benefit of capital growth and rental growth. So these actions will go a long way to help them decide which scenario would be appropriate for them. But yeah, later on in the episode, we'll work through each of the scenarios and where their borrowing capacity may sit currently based on work that our strategic mortgage broking team have done.
Beautiful. Kate, Alex has said, basically, we thought we were doing the right thing by purchasing investment properties as soon as we could, but because of our income and interest rates being where they are, they're falling short on the borrowing capacity now when it counts for the principal place of residence. I mean, we can't be too harsh at an investor having a crack and getting involved and purchasing a couple of properties pretty quickly. And what a time to own property in Victoria.
Yeah, look, their timing was great in hindsight. We've had almost 3 years of pretty static performance at best, declining values for a bit there. And I note that one of his properties is 10 years old, which means its land to asset ratio is probably quite good. But this is a classic case of rent vesting without understanding the perils of it. Rent vesting can be so great. When it's not great is when someone makes a decision to sell because they were really keen to buy their family home. And a lot of people don't think about how that emotional pressure or partner pressure or just life pressure is going to impact them at the time that they're a rent vestor and they're living at home or renting and life's working really well for them. All of a sudden, when they have that pressure to buy their home, they have to then make a decision to sell a property in a lot of cases. And that is one of Alex's options here. And the bit that bothers me is any investment is not a great idea if it's under 5 years, in my view, unless you're getting colossal gains or you've done something yourself to create genuine value. Property's not an asset that you trade. It's not a short-term trade at all. It should be long-term. So if it's a less than 5-year hold, you've got to then be really objective and reflect on the amount of money that this property has cost you, firstly to get into the asset and then to dispose of it. And then you've got CGT ramifications. And you could look at it and say, well, I've still had a bit of a gain, but could have you had a bigger gain if you'd gone straight into something like, shares, for example? So like I said, circling back to this, it's a classic case of the perils of rent vesting. And unfortunately, Alex's timing, while it was great, was also when we had a really low interest rate environment. And a lot of people who had never had lending before almost thought that was the new norm. And it so wasn't. And now that interest rates are back to normal, it's biting.
Yeah. And yesterday, as at the date of recording, we got the results of the September RBA meeting, and it seems like it's a very big possibility that we're done for 2025 when it comes to rate cuts. Who knows? That's a bit crystal
I was going to
ball,
say, on that note, I don't believe anything that any economists say, and I'm not suggesting that they don't know what they're talking about. It's just that things can change so quickly. We've had a little bit of data come through, and it's not like we had colossal changes to our reads. I mean, they were all reasonably slight if we look at them objectively. And still we're saying, well, with inflation where it's at and with employment where it's at, with GDP where it's at, we're not having a rate cut now. Now, none of those things on their own have been massive shocks to our system. It's not like we've had an inflation read and said, holy smokes, it's running out of control again. That's not happening. So these little subtle changes are having our economists pivot their decisions on what they think will happen. And that could change tomorrow, Mike. You and I both know.
I want to go to you, Dave, but a quick recap on the options that we've sort of got laid out by Alex. So first, keep both investment properties and, of course, do what they can to get the PPOR with that. Sell one of them. Obviously, that opens up a bit of capacity. They could move into one of them and wait for some value increases. And, of course, as you mentioned before, the fourth option was to keep both properties and see if they can buy another investment and hopefully ride a bit of a wave. Let's simplify it and bring it all back to sort of first principles. When Alex and his partner are starting to think about the next time, what are some of the things that they should be considering first of all?
Well, look, I guess, with first principles, building a property plan that creates as much wealth as possible, the best way to do that is to live in the cheapest home possible. If you're trying to optimize your investment property portfolio. Okay, so now it's still going to come down to lifestyle choices. What I've found over many, many years of developing property plans is people will have their lifestyle preferences. So what I would be saying to these guys is just get really clear on what they are, because you're sort of throwing about happy to live in one of my investment properties or buy another investment property and live in it. Okay, how long are you going to be happy to live in them for? Is that a long-term decision or a short-term decision? Is it a hopeful decision, but not something that's you're really going to be happy with? So this is what they need to work through. Like, look at that Reservoir property, look at that Pascoe Vale property. Okay, you say you're happy to live in one of them. That's great. How long will you be happy to do that for? And look, as I've already said, if you're happy to live at home as long as you can. You're going to be better off financially. But at some point, lifestyle is going to be prioritized. And then you might want to live in one of those two properties. Okay, which one is it? But how long are you going to be happy to do that? Because you've still got to be planning for your principal place of residence. Because I think it's going to come at some point. And that's so you can't not be planning simultaneously to trying to figure out what's the best way to go. You have to be doing it all at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think in some respects in the show, I know myself, I get focused in on the technically the best answer, the ones and the zeros. Like, this would be the best answer from a tax outcome, or this would be a best outcome from a net worth position or a cash flow position. But we're talking about people's lives, right? And often when you have people tossing up between a decision, a good way to help them through it is to go like, all right, I think you should do this. Just throw something at the wall, and then they'll get a very visceral reaction if that is wrong for them. So, when you talk about, okay, well, maybe we could live at home. If we were to say, okay, we think that's the best one, see how that sort of sits and rattles around with you, and you go, oh no, we're going to kill each other if we're living at home for another couple of years. So that's something that I think you guys are very good at considering, that whilst there might be technically a best answer, it's got to fit for Alex and his partner. Kate, with Alex being
just on that, sorry, just on that, it's also why having this conversation with an independent third party and advisor is so beneficial, because you have got someone saying these things to you, and you do have to consider them and talk them through. And if the property planner or the buyer's agent or whoever it is, the strategic mortgage broker, is good at their job, they'll actually tease out perhaps some of the different perspectives, in this case of a couple, when you're having that conversation. And it also allows, and I know I've said this other times along the podcast, the couple starts having a conversation they wouldn't necessarily have just when it was the two of them.
Yeah.
So you become a bit like a facilitator.
Yes. And Kate, you've mentioned a number of times about how relationships can be put under stress if somebody's pulling in one direction, somebody has a higher risk appetite, and often it sort of sounds like, I make fun of your job as driving around in a Range Rover and having lattes and looking at McMansions, but a lot of the times you are actually sort of almost like a psychologist working with two people who might not necessarily have the exact same feelings about a decision.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's imperative. And rent vesting, you often see those differences start to arise where one really wants the family home or their own home. Sometimes it can be precipitated by a sensitivity to getting a notice to vacate when that wasn't, what you were anticipating, or it could be, the nesting in us when a baby's on the way, or all number of things, just a change of heart, or could be a new partner who wasn't part of that original decision-making about the investment property. But whatever it is, you have to absolutely be on the same page first up before you then start making decisions about whether to dispose of assets or move into an asset or live at home with parents. This really has to be a team effort if it's a couple.
So we'd encourage Alex to have a good conversation with his partner, and remember our good friend Peter Kalisos' best advice for getting ahead in life is don't get divorced, and being on the same page is a good way to make sure that doesn't happen. Kate, Alex is concerned that his townhouses might not keep pace with houses in terms of growth. Do you think that's a reasonable concern?
It's a tough one, and I'll tell you why. People often cite this with me, but when you're comparing apples and oranges, it's not a fair comparison. And what I will do to explain what I mean there is let's have a think about what probably led them to the townhouses in the first place. They purchased Reservoir for $700,000, and they purchased Pascoe Vale for $600,000. Now, if they could buy a house in, let's say, Reservoir, they would have, to get a decent house in Reservoir, you're looking at over $1 million. In fact, you can spend $2 million in Reservoir on a nice house if you want to. They clearly didn't have that option. The other thing about houses is your rental yield in a city like Melbourne is usually at best 3%, whereas your townhouse you can get up to 4%. So it means that holding costs are a little bit buffered, and it might slightly impact the borrowing capacity when you're getting that bit of extra rent as well. But the main thing is your cash flow. So they made a decision to buy a townhouse. Now, if they wanted to buy a house for $700,000, they would have been a lot further out of the city than Reservoir. In fact, I don't think there's very many options where you'd buy in an area that doesn't have a really tough socioeconomic demographic. And with that comes other sets of challenges around being a landlord and having tenants. So let's say they either purchased something in a regional town like Ballarat, or they purchased in Werribee, and even at $700,000, you'd be pushing it to get something in a nice neighbourhood, or they're buying the townhouse. So we're comparing an apple and an orange. And that's a really hard comparison. And so I don't want to have a blanket approach and just say that houses outperform townhouses. I think you've also got to look at the quality of the townhouse, the age of it, how many are in the block, how well it's run, what the strata's like, where it's located in relation to shops and transport. So I think I could find a $700,000 townhouse that could outperform a $700,000 house. But it just comes down to that selection and the other things that have guided the purchase decisions.
Yeah, that's a really good insight there, and I suppose that they're concerned about it because they've got these two townhouses, but it's only a consideration if they're looking at buying another one or they're selling one, I suppose. But Dave, let's go to you, because this is obviously your wheelhouse and you've kept your powder a little bit dry so far. What are some of the different scenarios that Alex could explore when he's weighing up the next steps, especially whether to hold or sell?
Yeah, and look, just on that point, one thing he could do is he's owned Pascoe Vale for 10 years. Look at what the initial purchase price was for that property 10 years ago. Look at how much it's grown over those 10 years versus the house market in Pascoe Vale. And then you get some sort of direct comparison. You might even find a few houses that sold 10 years ago in Pascoe Vale and see its capital growth relative to your townhouse. The Reservoir property is only 3 years old, so it's a bit harder to measure. But obviously, that's the best way to track it. You can talk townhouses versus houses, but what you're best to do is measure. These are individual specific properties. Measure how they've performed against the house market in those suburbs, and if that's not where you're looking to purchase your long-term home, how they've compared against the house market where you look to purchase your long-term home. That's the best way to compare your two properties versus the house market that you're looking to get into for the principal place of residence.
In saying that too, I mean, if one sort of sector kind of underperforms and that reaches a stretching point, there is almost like a bit of an elastic that could potentially bring them together. We are kind of talking about our mean reversion here, which we spent a whole episode talking about the merits and some of the issues with it. But how would you kind of consider that if houses have outperformed townhouses for that sort of 3 or 5 year period? Well, there might actually be a stronger value proposition in a townhouse rather than a house. Or do you kind of think past performance is pretty robust in terms of predicting the future?
I think each layer of analysis gives you information. It doesn't necessarily give you the perfect information, but sometimes it will. You might find that, this specific townhouse has real issues and it's underperformed by a long way. You can compare it against the rest of the townhouse market or other townhouse markets as well. So, yeah, the point is, like, the more specific you get with the analysis to the actual properties you're talking about, the better your judgment will be on whether they're a good quality asset or not.
Yeah, good point. All right. So in your view, in terms of the scenarios, how would you kind of recap the different strategies that they mentioned above and any sort of tweaks that you might throw at them?
Yeah, so look, having done the numbers, it does come down to their lifestyle preference, I believe. So, I mean, if they want to keep both investments, they're in a position to only borrow perhaps 150,000 with a major lender, maybe up to 400,000 with a second tier. So they're not able to purchase that home at this point in time, at least, and keep both. So if they moved into one of the investment properties and then purchased the principal place of residence later, that obviously is a consideration, and that'll really boil down to capital growth, savings and income growth as to whether or not they can purchase that principal place of residence later. But as I've already touched on, living at home for longer and then being able to live in one of the investment properties, but it gives them time and would get them closer to being able to achieve that. I suspect they're going to need to sell at least one, though. So in terms of selling one investment and purchasing a principal place of residence, the team have worked out that there's still a way off there. They could purchase up or borrow up to about 450 with a major lender, and maybe a 650, maybe 700 with a second tier, but they've said they want to pay 850. So they're still not in a position to do that at the moment. In terms of selling one investment and purchasing another investment, that does give them more scope to potentially buy the home but rent it out at first. They could be looking at around high 600s there, or even into the 750 mark with a second tier lender. So that provides them with a little bit more room to move. And then if they sell both, well, they'll be able to purchase at that 850 tier level, give or take, with a major or maybe a second tier with a real, I guess, a third tier lender. They could even look to get up to $1 million. So, yeah, so like there's not a black and white answer, and it will come down to their lifestyle preferences, as I said from the start. How long can you keep living at home? But that's obviously best for your financial position. Then moving into one of the two investment properties, you're holding them for longer, assuming they are keeping pace with your future home. You've got 1.3 million in the market. It's always, when I'm looking at property plans like this, always look for them to have at least the equal, if not more, in the market currently than what they plan to pay for the future home. So they're not going to fall behind. So they've got 1.3 million in the market, and their future home's worth 850. So, I mean, even if that 1.3 grows at a slower pace, we don't want it to, and obviously that's something we've talked through. They need to consider. They're even if they sold both, they're still well and truly going to be able to buy that future home. But obviously, what'll buy them time to potentially be able to only have to sell one rather than two, or maybe, but I think it's going to be difficult, not have to sell either, is time. And that time can be, achieved through staying at home for as long as possible, living in one of the investment properties for as long as possible, then potentially renting. And then, that might get them, I don't know their personal circumstances, but that might get them 3 years, it might get them 5 years, it might get them 7 years. That 7 year time frame may get them into a position where they can purchase a home without selling both. But I suspect, and from based on my experience, they'll need to sell at least one at one point in time.
Yeah. Timing, I think, is a critical one that I wanted to ask you about, Kate, because we've got two beautiful, juicy eggs in the Melbourne basket. We've also got a time horizon where they're 28, kind of thinking maybe family at 31, maybe married at 30. So maybe we've got a couple of years to play with there. On top of that, they're savers, right? If we go back to their figures, combined salary of 171, combined living expenses of 50. If we think about the differential there, we get a couple of years of that saving, we get a couple of years of growth in those properties. It's a completely different equation potentially to what we're talking about today, right?
It is. Look, Dave steps through the scenarios. What I'd like to talk about is there's 5 scenarios here. Keep both investments and wait, which I don't think is viable. Scenario 2, move into one of the investment properties, then purchase a PPOR later. Like, is that going to work for them? That's a question for them. Scenario 3, sell an investment, purchase PPOR. It will obviously be a very reduced purchase price. They want this property to last them for 10 years and they want it to be 20K from the CBD. Again, I don't think that's viable. I don't think they'll be happy with what they get for the number that Dave's shared. Number 4, sell an investment and purchase another investment. I just keep thinking, what's the point? We're back to the scenario prior. They're still not getting enough there to get them what they want. To buy a family home that will last them for 10 years within 20 kilometres of the CBD, they're going to need a sizable amount. And then scenario 5 is sell both investments and purchase the PPOR. I actually have a scenario 6 for them to contemplate. What about if they were to sell both of the investments, purchase their future PPOR, keep it as an investment, stay at home and keep saving? They will then have some tax deductions, they'll have some rental income, they'll have some added savings because they've got essentially a free or a very subsidised roof over their head, and they've got 2 years to enjoy that. So if they were to do my scenario number 6, they've got to choose really carefully, but I also think they've got to be prepared to pretty much put all of their savings and their borrowing capacity into this to make it the most optimal and long-term future-proofed home for themselves that they can. And they've got to be very honest about what their real needs are and get something that they will absolutely enjoy, but have the discipline to not move into it for another 2 years. And I think their financial position, when we do the numbers, would be even better because they will be able to borrow more as a result of having additional income to factor into their servicing. And they'll also have the sale proceeds from the 2 properties that they've sold. And while they might feel that they've let themselves down because they've sold an investment that they thought had a longer shelf life, they've got to treat this as their optimal, significant investment. It's the jewel in the crown. And I can confidently say that a house in these similar areas, which I think they could afford if they do this, it will outperform the townhouse. We're not comparing an apple and an orange when we do purchase something in that Reservoir, Pascoe Vale, whatever it might be, the middle ring of Melbourne's northern suburbs.
There you go. And you've still got roughly the same amount invested in the market. It's just
That's
your
right.
future PPOR. So I hate the idea of, taking their market exposure away, especially at a time like we're in now where Victoria has got some very good green shoots and we could see a big increase in house prices in the next little while. Dave, option 6, we've come at you from around the wicket on this one. What do you reckon?
Oh, look, it's a bit of a extension of an option or 2 in there already. Because I would say, that's an absolute viable option in terms of, obviously we've talked about the potential that they would need to sell both, the potential to rent it out at first, but I would throw in there you know, don't do that. If you go down that path, still don't do that until you have to. So get your ducks in a row, stay living at home, you know, work out, you know, because you might be able to extend your purchase price further. But also what I'd throw into the mix there is not, they're talking about a place for 10 years. Particularly with this option, I would be saying try to find a place that is your lifetime house. And that sort of connects to what Kate's saying too about, you know, don't make it something that is just going to sort of tick a few of the boxes, because what's going to happen, and I see it all the time, people come out hard out of the blocks and try and buy investment properties. Principal place of residence does this to them, and they end up having to sell all if they only own one, or both if they own two, or at least one of them, and it has a big impact on their investment strategy. Then they buy a home that they then upgrade again later on, and they go through this whole process again. And they might have snuck in one investment property at some part along the way, and they've got to sell it. They haven't held it for long enough, you know. So my point would be to, if you're going to sell both, but either way, try and make the home the long-term home and have that mindset. Otherwise, you run the risk of going through this whole tricky planning process in 7 to 10 years' time. Now, there's no guarantee you won't, but if you can really nail that long-term through to retirement home with your first purchase, that is what you want to try and do.
One of the options that Kate dismissed as, you know, maybe just shuffling pieces and what's the point, is selling one investment property, buying another one. So we're still back to two, but that one is potentially the future principal place of residence. I suppose the advantage of that particular scenario is because we're not sort of buying it as a PPOR, we are buying it as an investment. We have more borrowing capacity because it will have a tenant in there. And, you know, if you move into it 2 or 3 years down the track, you don't need to tell the bank, you just need to be able to service that. Would you kind of challenge that as being viable, or do you agree with Kate that it's kind of maybe this is a bit of a pointless exercise?
So you're saying if you sold one investment property and
replaced
bought a new one
with another that is
The
the
issue
future.
is the borrowing capacity, Mike. The issue is they want a 3 to 4 bedroom house in Melbourne within 20 kilometres of the CBD. Even if they dispose of one of these assets, I don't think they've got enough to buy that product.
Even as
They'll be
rental
making a
rather
compromise.
than principal place of residence.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting one to run. It's certainly an option for them to check in with the strategic mortgage broker about what their capacity looks like if they were to rent it out.
Yeah.
But I'm on the same
we did
page
that.
as Dave.
We said that scenario, and that it doesn't get them enough. It only gets them about 450 to 500, or with a second tier lender, they could maybe get 650 to 700. But it's, you know, they said they want a home for 850. They're going to end up not happy with it in the short term, and back where they are now.
I think, you know, if we're talking Melbourne suburbs, and I don't want to get so Melbourne centric that all of our interstate listeners tune out, but in that 20k radius in the northern suburbs, you've got, you know, Broadmeadows, Lalor, Thomastown, Hadfield, Glenroy. They're at the very edge of that 20k stretch, and they're all sitting in that $850 to $1 million mark, with the exception of maybe Broadmeadows. But we're not going to get a house in a good area that they'll be happy with that's, you know, 4 bedrooms for under $750. It's not an option. So
it would require the timing, right, to get some equity growth in maybe the 2 investment properties they have now, and bank up a bit of savings, and then maybe in 2 years they'd have the ability to possibly
income growth,
sell one. But
you're challenging the same area
at the same time, right?
Well, if the market doesn't grow at the same time, that's the catch. Let's say the houses do really well and the townhouse doesn't, then that's a false economy. They've spent 2 years waiting for something that won't reward them. They'll get a small amount of growth out of the townhouse, and then they could be priced out of the house. So it is a tricky one, and part of me thinks work out what you absolutely want as your long-term move and then go for it.
Yep.
Because if we're looking at what the future might hold in 2 or 3 years' time, I think you're taking a risk against the market, and it could be a two-speed market for houses and townhouses. We don't know. It has been before.
I think
Dave?
the upside, and that was one of the points I made before, is they have 1.3 million in the market, and they've said they're happy with a home for 850. Now, let's say, and I think you'll be right, Kate, based on my experience as well. They'll actually, when they look properly and start getting emotionally connected to the home they want to buy, they'll find it's actually going to cost 950, 1 million, 1.1 million, maybe higher. But at least they have 1.3 million in the market, so even if what they have in the market grows a little bit slower than, say, houses that they're going to end up purchasing as a home, they're still going to be sort of keeping pace with the growth. Whereas, if you're dealing with people developing a property plan and their investment properties total value is less than the home they look to buy, that's when it's a much bigger risk.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Dave, this is a pretty good example of how easy it can be to get caught up in the idea of buying property without necessarily fully thinking about the longer term plans. What guidance can you share with people that are listening to this show that are in a similar position in and around that planning piece?
Look, I think, they've probably learned a lot from the conversation because, we thought there was 4 or 5 scenarios. Kate's thrown up a 6th scenario. There's no simple solution, and it's different for each individual and couple. And so the earlier you start planning, the better. And it's not easy. No one knows our future. It's not set in stone. We don't know, when we're going to start a family necessarily, and when we're going to get married, if we're going to get married or have a family, all these factors. But the earlier we start planning, and I do think we all can have a fair idea of what we'd like our future to be. I know personally, I always hope to get married. I always hope to have a family. People who potentially don't plan to get married and plan to have a family probably have that sense of that in themselves as well when they're in their 20s, So my point is that everyone's pathway can be different, but even before you've met your long-term loved one if you don't plan to get married, you can have a sense of what your long-term plan, what you would like your life to look like before you're buying your first property. And therefore, you can set up a property plan through to retirement at that point in time. And it's going to help you make better decisions in advance so you don't necessarily get in these tricky positions like so many people get into.
The planning stuff is so critical. But I do want to say that, Alex, don't be too forlorn about getting in and having a crack. I mean, obviously staying at home is a very smart financial position. You're saving. A lot of people with that amount of what could potentially be disposable income, they find a way to get rid of it. But getting in and purchasing those properties, whether you feel like they've maybe underperformed houses or not, everyone's a genius in hindsight, right? We know what we would have bought if we could go back in time 10 years ago, and we'd all be billionaires, right? Crypto and Townsville and Perth and Darwin and all these different places that have gone through the roof. So I definitely commend you for what you've done so far. What do you think, Kate?
I think Dave said something that is insightful, and I want to build on that. It's very easy to be self-critical and think, I've wasted stamp duty, I've wasted holding costs, I'm about to waste agent selling fees, marketing fees, and CGT. And yes, there is a bit of a chunk of fees when you're selling a property. But the way to look at it is exactly as Dave said. You've leveraged 1.3 in the market. And if you swap that out for a family home, you're still leveraging 1.3. And to sweeten that deal, in the same suburb, when I'm comparing apples and apples, your townhouse might perform I'm just using broad numbers here, so please don't take this as financial advice. Let's say the house is averaging 7% year on year, and the townhouse is averaging 6% year on year. Whatever that differential is, there will be a differential because they're in the same area, and the house will outperform a townhouse in the same area in most cases, unless it's a big boutique luxury townhouse. So over the long term, when you've got 1.3 in the market working at 7% versus 1.3 working at 6%, you've got a definite net benefit there. The only thing that they're giving up if they dispose of these two properties is obviously the rental income. And they might have had an idea in their mind or a figure in their head about how many properties they wanted at a certain age, but all in good time. Because if these rent vesting properties are holding you back from achieving, family happiness, then you've really got to think about it. And like Dave said, there's no right or wrong answer here. Their circumstances might allow them to spend 5 years in one of the investment properties and be really happy there. So it just comes down to working out what their priority is and what their comfort zones and choices are.
Yeah, very good point. All right, I think now it's time to go to our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
So my gold nugget is, it's just building on what Kate was just saying. If you end up selling both and you get that long-term home that is absolutely fabulous, you could live in, raise your kids, see yourself living in it until you're at a right size, downsize. The family home can be a very powerful investment. There's no capital gains tax when you sell it, which is a huge benefit. It's not counted in the means test for, things like the pension, if another sort of, you can use it with the downsizer contribution into superannuation later in life if you downsize and take a fair big chunk and stick it into super. So there are a lot of advantages about the home. The other thing too is if you do get that home and you don't have to go through this trading process in 10 years' time, every decision from now on, once you free up the cash flow and you're in the position to do it, can be an investment that won't get knocked out of place like happens so often when we start off with investments without a plan for the principal place of residence.
My best advice to those thinking about rent vesting is to be very clear on when you think you might want a home, or make sure that you've provisioned for that if it's important. Because if you're going into this with less than a 5-year hold, I would recommend having a rethink. And less than a 10-year hold, I still feel a little bit uncomfortable. You want it to be a sustained long-term hold. And that might mean chewing off a smaller amount of buying power to leave a little bit of room for the rest of it. All of this needs to be done in consultation with someone who absolutely knows what they're talking about when it comes to servicing and lending policy. And I think a chat with a strategic mortgage broker before you rent vest is probably one of the best investments you could make.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I want to circle back and say, Alex, I think you've got your head screwed on well. You're saving money. You took some action. You're asking the really, really intelligent questions, and going out
100%.
for support rather than just making a decision based on a barbecue. For me, the big elephant.
And he's only
in the
28,
room,
isn't he?
Oh yeah, I know.
It's an amazing achievement.
I know. I was being ridiculous at 28 rather than sensible like Alex and his partner. The big elephant in the room for me is the differential between the performance of those townhouses and what might be the house or the PPOR that they could be purchasing. If there's not a differential in the potential capital growth, then I love the idea of holding on to them as long as you possibly can, staying at home if that becomes untenable, perhaps renting in the location where they're thinking might be where their forever home lives, because I think that can also give you, maybe 12 months of experience to go, actually, we thought we needed 2 bedrooms, but we need 4, or we thought we needed 3, but we need 3 in a study, or, we actually now know living here that off-street parking is a deal breaker, or a double garage is a deal breaker. I think sometimes that can be a worthwhile experiment to make sure that you're clear on exactly what you want, because if you want to park yourself in it for 10 years, I've been in a situation where I've purchased a PPOR that wasn't quite fit for the family purpose, and it just became a pain in the backside. So if there's there's a big differential between the townhouses and the principal place of residence, I really like the strategy of getting that PPOR, whether you're renting it out or not is kind of moot, but that's kind of where my head is at. But I think a lot of different options there. And as the guys have said, it's what fits for your lifestyle and what feels right and what you can stomach. I mean, if we come up with a strategy that is the best on paper, but it's not going to make you happy, then throw it in the bin. Guys, what do we reckon? Any final thoughts?
I reckon that's a great wrap.
Beautiful. All right. Well,
6
thanks
solutions
very much.
to think about.
Just shows the complexity of
Good
developing
luck with it
property
all,
plans.
Alex.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly true, and we could definitely recommend sitting down and, as the guys have said, having a facilitator to run through those options and having an open and honest conversation, because you might be favouring one particular idea and your partner's saying, look, I don't think that's going to work for me personally, and you've got to be on the same page. So great question. Congratulations on where you are so far. I wish you all the best. Please stay in touch and let us know how you get on, and come to our live event. I'd love to give you a glass of Shiraz. Until then, we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
See you next week.